Recording is started, and I appreciate that reminder.
There's still quite a buzz.
What's that, Deidre?
There's a buzz going on. Ah, that stopped. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, if everyone please make sure they are muted, except Ella, of course. Okay, Ella, we'll turn it over to you, and you can begin.
Great, thanks so much, Jack, and thanks for being invited along. Or good everyone. So I'm sorry, I'm just to note that I'm not going to be able to see faces or the messages while I'm using because of so just interrupt me if there's something wrong, please. So just a bit of background actually is this is a piece of research that I carried out quite a long time ago. So back in 2013, I completed it. And there was a bit of surprise when Jack contacted me around this piece of work, asking a few more questions. And in particular, some work that I did in collaboration with the Royal Society on a piece called The Sustainable Carrying Capacity of New Zealand. And that it didn't really go into a huge amount of detail. So Jack's asked me to give a little bit more context from that particular piece of work. So I guess what I'm presenting is really hopefully a bit of a foundation for further discussion, because there's certainly been a lot more thinking about this since this time. But I thought I'd let that evolve rather than to through the discussion rather than to steer it in any massive way. So as I mentioned, this was research I finished a long time ago. I feel a little bit rusty. I must admit I've spent the last couple of days going back over pieces of my research in terms of my thesis. So hopefully I can provide you enough information, but also I can share where you might be able to find more information in the future. And I'm sure you will all be able to add a lot of your knowledge to this. So just bear with me if I stumble over a few of the comments and things. So I was just going to briefly cover over what biocapacity actually is, and a little bit about where this concepts come from, and it has been used in New Zealand, and I can give a few of those examples at the end as well. So the New Zealand Footprint project and how that came about, and what it was set out to achieve, and what information we learnt from that. I did do a bit of additional work looking at sort of various scenarios that might be run for communities and how they might be able to live within their carrying capacity or biocapacity. And then the Otago Fed Economy project, which further built on that work, looking specifically at food. So quite often I use this photo to remind everyone of our infinite existence and on or finite existence on a finite planet. And there's quite a good exercise that you can take people through where you sort of use an apple to show exactly how much of the planet we actually use to produce the goods and services we consume. And I won't take you through that today, but ultimately, if you cut that apple down to about 1/24th, then you've removed the oceans, the deserts, those areas that people can't live, places that are too steep and too cold, the mountains, and you've got 1/24th, and then you peel the skin off that apple, and that's the very thin layer of the planet that we're using to support our human goods and services. And it gives a real context to, we for a long time thought that we had so much space and so much land, and in fact, we know now that we have very little. So biocapacity is the measure of the bioproductive utility of land for humans. It's the amount of biological productive production required to renew the resources humans use, so particularly the renewables, and absorb the waste that we produce, so particularly the carbon dioxide emissions from energy use. But it's very important to understand that as the health of those systems that we rely on to produce that biocapacity decline, so does the ability for that system to produce those goods and services. There's some really good evidence showing the amount of reduction in the health of our systems, and you will all recognise the planetary boundaries. So we've severely degraded some of those systems, and obviously climate change is just a symptom of the reduced health and resilience of our system, carbon system. So the ecological footprint tool measures the total biocapacity consumed by a population, which can then be compared to what is available. And to achieve sustainable outcome, one must match the other. So we're looking for our consumption to essentially align with our production, consumption to align with our available biocapacity. And we're trying to, I guess, achieve the most amount of well-being or, fulfillment in life through by doing that, but still living within those limits. So it's, again, to reiterate, it's that supply, it's the amount of productive land, and it's the demand on that land. So it's not only the goods and services produced, but it's also the land required to absorb the waste that's generated. And the ecological footprint is used to measure a particular population's consumption. So it could be at an individual level, or it could be at a city or a country, or at a planetary-wide level. So the measure for the ecological footprint, and I'll reiterate this again, but in terms of consumption, we're looking at the production minus the export plus the import. So we're really looking at that population's consumption, and that's really important when we come to calculating New Zealand's footprint, because obviously we have a lot of export and we have a lot of tourism, and those calculations have to be subtracted from our overall consumption to give a New Zealand footprint. And so obviously this concept of biocapacity has brought about the idea of overshoot, so that we are using more of the Earth's available biocapacity than what's available. I've often used this idea of the declining health of the natural system with our increasing ecological footprint, or the consumption of resources, as well as increasing population, which is creating this funnel, or this the funnel metaphor, or the squeeze on society. And really what we need to do is to reverse these trends, reducing ecological footprint and increasing the health of the natural system. So Jack and I were actually just talking about Bill Rees's presentation at one of his events. So the ecological footprint was made famous by the Bill Rees in association with Matthias Wachenackel and their work through the Global Footprint Network. So they've used this tool as an education tool, particularly using this concept of Earth Overshoot Day. So that's the day whereby we exceed the use of one Earth's worth of resources. And as you can see by this diagram, down the vertical axis on the left, you've got the months of the year, and along the bottom you've got the years from 1970 through to 2021. And as you can see, the day at which we reach the available resources for the planet has declined each year, other than a wee blip during COVID in 2020. And we've gone from using one Earth's resources to 1.7 Earth's resources over the course of a full year. So that's on a global scale. Helpfully, they also give you where individual countries hit that overshoot, that point of overshoot. So on the top left, you'll see that there's Indonesia, and on the top right, you'll see there's Qatar. And the big arrow down below is where New Zealand comes in. So we're definitely in the higher consuming end of the globally in terms of countries' consumption. So this is essentially saying that if everyone on the planet lived like a New Zealander, then that we would be hitting overshoot by May 15th. So another concept that's come about through the use of the ecological footprint is this idea of fair earth share. And so that's taking the total amount of available biocapacity on the planet and dividing it by the total number of people. And so this graph's really showing that there's, as the population increases and as the not only the available land, but also the health of that land decreases, and so the amount of land per person decreases considerably. The global population increased from 3 billion in 1959 to 7 billion in 2011, resulting in the earth share decreasing by more than half, from 3.96 global hectares to 1.7 global hectares per person. And then obviously going to continue, if you believe that we're going to continue to live in society as it is and continue to consume and increase in population, then you know, it's showing out to 2080 there that we're going to be down at about 1 hectare per person. As was shown previously by the previous diagram, it's not just, you know, obviously we consume differently across different countries, but also really importantly, different countries have different biocapacity, not only because of the amount of land they have available to them within that country, but also because of the actual, I guess, capacity of that land to produce goods and services. So obviously, depending on temperature and soil type and you know, all sorts of things. So this particular map is showing, according to the consumption of that country, whether or not that country could live or be sustained by the biocapacity of that country. And so you can see the countries in the red are those that are in massively in debt, is how they explain it, whilst the ones in green are in surplus. So this doesn't specifically reflect the actually whether that country is an overshoot, because it doesn't consider the actual likes of the export from that country. So we'll go on to that next for New Zealand. So is New Zealand an overshoot? It's a good question. And interesting that there hasn't been more work on this done, because as we'll talk about later, it's certainly a concept that keeps coming up, but not at a sort of nationwide scale and consideration of consumption. So and I'll also explain later that I'm using a different unit of measure here. It's actually the New Zealand hectare compared to the global footprint network's global hectares. So for the purposes of this particular project, there was more value in having a New Zealand specific measure. So these figures will not compare to what you might see for the global footprint network, for example. So I just needed to make that really clear. I calculated that these figures for biocapacity, and so when I looked at the global footprint network figures and actually did some background research on those, I found that the way that they had equated some of our land types was a real overestimate. So ultimately, it was a very conservative estimate of our biocapacity. and it could be as much as 1.7 times more than what we actually have. So these were my calculations, showing that we had a biocapacity of about 27.2 million hectares across New Zealand. And at the time of this research, I used 2011 data, we had 4.2 million people. And I guess the question is, how do we want to use it? So if we directly just say, oh, well, we've got that biocapacity, we're going to divide it by the people, then we've got 6.5 hectares per person. And as you'll see later, that's actually quite a lot of land, and some of the higher footprints across the country that I found would be happy using 6.5 hectares per person per year. However, where I did use the Global Footprint Network data was to understand how much of the what we consume in New Zealand is actually what we produce in New Zealand, and what's actually using New Zealand biocapacity versus what we import and what we export. So it showed that we consume the equivalent of 45% of New Zealand's total biocapacity, but we actually import half of that. So we're actually only using about half of that as New Zealand biocapacity. So we export a whopping 87% of New Zealand's equivalent of New Zealand's biocapacity.
Bamboo pole now.
So I'm not sure who's got that, who hasn't been muted, but I can hear someone talking about bamboo. Sorry. So we export a whopping 82%, which is amazing, really. So overall, we're actually overall it was showing that we were already in about 4% overshoot. And remember, that was with quite conservative estimates by the Global Footprint Network. However, and so if we were to actually take that and look at the biocapacity of New Zealand being 27.2, and we wanted to continue to sustain an export industry where we're exporting 82% of our biocapacity and trying to live within the biocapacity of our country, we're actually looking at a footprint of about 1.2 hectares per person per year, which is very minimal. And I only really found one person that was living in one family that was living anywhere near that amount, that lower footprint. So, and interestingly enough, very close to our fair share in terms of what we've looked like for New Zealand. So we've, that's that big question. So if we want to live within that biocapacity, or we make that decision, or we're forced to, or for whatever reason, then there's some significant changes that are going to need to be made. And not to mention that we currently import half of what we consume, which I also thought was a fascinating figure. So just a bit of a background. So the New Zealand Footprint Project was aimed to understand the current resource consumption of New Zealanders across different urban forms and lifestyles. It came about in about 2008, where Robert and Brenda Vale, which some of you may know from Victoria University School of Architecture, they were using the ecological footprint in various forms. And they were interested in how different urban forms and obviously lifestyles could change to better live within the biocapacity of those areas. And so joined together, and then how that would actually impact policy. So they joined together with Otago Polytechnic, where I was working at the time, along with what was Manukau City Council, later to be Auckland Council and Central Otago District Council. Kapiti Coast came on later as an interested party who had already done a bit of work in this space. Then it was funded by the Foundation for Science Research Technology, FORST. So we were interested not only what the sort of ecological footprint of urban form and New Zealand lifestyles look like, but also how we might transform those into lower footprint communities in the future, and to the extent of how people might live within a fairer share. I was also personally really interested in how we might use this as an education and communication tool, and so I did work with various artists and things along the way to better understand that and explore So just really briefly, as a bit of a background in terms of process, when we brought the whole team together in terms of this collective group of organisations, and they helped to create this project and come up with the process. So they were kept in the loop the whole way along, with the hope that it was going to help us better understand how this work could influence policy moving forward. The first thing, as both the project manager and the lead researcher for this project, I went about trying to calculate the New Zealand ecological footprint. So ultimately, that was everything that, as I mentioned before, that equation of everything we consume, everything we produce, plus imports minus exports. So it took about 1.5 years. That was quite a big project. And then if you divided that by the total population, then you got the ecological footprint for an individual, or the average ecological footprint. And then we needed to go about creating a questionnaire and a calculator that was fit for New Zealand and for the purposes of this project. We carried out about 180 surveys of individuals across New Zealand in 5 different communities, so those different urban forms. And then analyse the data to look at community and lifestyle footprints, and finally those fair share community scenarios that were developed. All along, communities were presented to and we were talked about. So I think one of the real values of this project was actually that we got to talk about these concepts to audiences that really had not ever touched on this sort of work before. And try and explore different ways of how you might engage them. So it was quite interesting. But anyway, so as I mentioned before, the ecological footprint is about supply and demand. And in terms of supply and the biocapacity of New Zealand, in the way that we measure the ecological footprint, you measure it against land. So the assumption is that everything that we consume, all the goods and services and all the waste that we create, can be calculated back to the amount of land that is used to produce it. So the ecological footprint doesn't cover things like chemicals and non-renewables. Except for where you come to sequestering for things particularly like fossil fuels, where you're able to calculate the total amount of land required to sequester the waste or the emissions from those materials. So different goods and services require different types of land, and I'll try and go into that in a little bit more detail, but just giving an example. So forest land, as you can see on the right of that diagram, you could imagine is used for obviously things like timber for housing, but also for cardboard and paper and things like that for packaging. Energy land, as I was just starting to explain or touched on, is the land required to sequester the carbon dioxide, methane, climate change emissions, related emissions, back into the carbon cycle. And it does consider a small amount of, or a very conservative estimate of what the ocean cycles also sequester. So grazing land, obviously the land required for grazing animals, cropland for growing food, urban land is the built up land and that land covered, and fishing land, which is a little more complex, and I will just touch on it briefly. It's actually a bit of a challenging one, and the figures for New Zealand had also already been challenged prior to my research by Manaaki Whenua Lanka Research and some of their researchers. And so the fishing land considers the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone for a country, which is thought of as being the most productive part of that country, or of the fishing area. But the productivity of that land is incredibly low compared to what you might find on land. So the ecological footprint associated is massive, and I'll talk about it a bit more about how the footprint looks both with and without that fishing land included. So just keeping back in mind that when we're talking about biocapacity, it's not just the on land, it's also that productive land that we're talking about for fishing land, and that's considered as well. Otherwise, how would we account for the marine life that we consume and impact? And obviously need to do better at working within its carrying capacity, because we know the destruction we're causing. So just coming back to a bit of an example of the likes of cropland, grazing land and fishing land. So this is the amount of food that might be produced on any given hectare. So as I said, those different land types have quite considerably different amount of productivity. So cropland, you can produce a considerably larger amount of crop food than you can for amount of grazing land versus the amount of fishing land, or the amount produced on a hectare of fishing land. Sorry. So 14 times more on on 1 hectare of crop, 5.5 times more grazing land than product on grazing land than you can on fishing land. And sorry, just to add, when I'm talking about built up land, interestingly, the calculation and the conversion used for that assumes that urban land is actually the same productivity as cropping land, which is really important because as societies have grown, we've grown up around our food producing areas, which is obviously a problem when it comes to our ability to produce food. But it also means when I looked at urban forms, I included garden land as one of the additional areas that haven't traditionally been used in the ecological footprint, because I wanted to be able to account for those people who grew food in their own land and on their own land. So it's already accounted for in your footprint if you own land, if you own your backyard, for example. And therefore, if you're able to use that, then you're able to have a double use for that land rather than just purely as a place to mow your grass. So as I mentioned before, the ecological footprint is consumption of all the goods and services and the land for sequestering waste. To calculate that, you calculate the total amount of goods and services produced by a given area, then you add the amount that's imported minus the amount that's exported, and that gives you a total ecological footprint. So that first bit is production, and the second part is the net ecological footprint of trade. In terms of how I went about calculating the ecological footprint, it was messy, it was big, it was very, very time consuming. Ultimately, I was looking at the total amount produced for New Zealand, and then working with our export and trade figures, but also I was looking at the amount that tourists consume, and I was trying to subtract that from particularly things like food, travel and accommodation, and I was trying to back it all up using individual type layer of data. So I was looking at, for example, the national car use across the country, and then I was looking at data about how much individuals use their cars and for what purposes. And it all got very complicated. It was quite interesting, but I'm glad I was very focused and I didn't have things like children to distract me. And then we needed to then break it down into categories. So using the top-down, bottom-up approach, we looked at the individual household footprints, so covering food and drink, travel, consumer goods and holidays. And then we looked at your household footprints, the energy and housing, and then we looked at your citizenship footprint. So that's all the infrastructure, governance and services that are required as a country. For each of those areas, we mapped out I guess, the life cycle of those products and the types of land that might be required. And sorry, that's in quite a small print, but it's an example of the food footprint, which took probably about half the amount of time of the overall footprint. It was incredibly complex, particularly with how to figure out what we export and import. So, and that it also used almost every type of land for whatever purposes, for, you know, whether it be for packaging or obviously sequestering all the emissions related to that. And just as a reminder, it's that equation around consumption, production, export and import. So constantly looking back and thinking about actually what is it that New Zealanders are using, not what other people visiting the country or what we're exporting might be using. And finally, after about 2 years of playing with data, we came up with the the average ecological footprint for New Zealanders using New Zealand hectares. So again, I can talk a bit more detail about why that versus global hectares, but worked better for this particular project. So across the different land types and across those different categories, with a total of about 2.5 hectares per person. So if we go back to the conversation we were having before in terms of New Zealand's biocapacity, so if everyone lived on the planet, lived like a New Zealander, according to my research, we would need about 2.7 planets to sustain us, which is pretty significant, given we only have one. And the fair earth share for New Zealand, using its biocapacity, is 1.2 New Zealand hectares per person. So we're about twice on average, for the average footprint, we're about twice our fair earth share. So we've got quite a lot of reducing to do if we want to fit within that. Obviously, the average New Zealand footprint varies considerably depending on lifestyle, but as I'll show you later, it really didn't have a huge amount of impact depending on urban form, a little bit for those very rural areas, but really surprisingly little. So also just to note that we were to use the entire biocapacity of New Zealand of 27.2 million hectares, and we divided it by the average New Zealand footprint, we could sustain about 11 million people. But again, that's saying that we're not going to have any export and we're not going to have any import. For some whatever reason, we've been isolated off. And that's also assuming that we're now producing all of those things that we previously imported. So there's a lot of questions there. In terms of the average ecological footprint and how it used different types of land, as I mentioned, that fishing land component of the ecological footprint is incredibly controversial and it's quite difficult. So of all of the land that we used, 34% of that was the biocapacity of fishing land. And if we were to look into that, we would see that we're very much an overshoot in that area. And then we had energy land and grazing land and so on, sort of probably what you could imagine. So I did do a lot of playing around with using fishing land and then not having fishing land included in those calculations. So this is looking at the ecological footprint by category rather than land, as we looked at it previously. So by category, one of the reasons food took so long to look at was because of its complexity, but because of also its enormity. And I kept going back and thinking, really, is that the figure for that? And remember, this isn't what we export. This is only what New Zealanders are consuming, and it's massive. So this is the equivalent of New Zealand hectares of what New Zealanders consume. So it does include what we import. And then our travel was much lower than I expected in comparison to food and consumer goods. So those were really those are the big areas, and considerably larger than what I expected in terms of household, for example, where I thought household energy and the embodied energy of buildings and that sort of thing would be much higher. sorry, and as I mentioned, played around with it a bit to look at what it looked like without fishing land in that food footprint. So this is the footprint minus fishing, and as you can see, it massively changes the food component of that, and really highlights that consumer goods are also have a major part to play in that ecological footprint. Tourism's still big, but so is household. And then holidays, interestingly, and if you think about the amount of time that we are actually on holiday, and that it makes up 8% of our footprint, mainly due to the fact that we fly everywhere. And then I was also able to delve into a whole lot of detail in particular areas, and I'm happy to discuss any of this further later. But the food footprint, for example, was fascinating to me. And, you know, of our total food footprint, 76% of that is actually in growing land. So that's in particular for our meat and dairy. We're using a huge amount of land to supply us with those products, and sequester the waste that's produced from that system. So I'm not going to delve into a huge amount of detail there, but there's all sorts of ways that we can reduce those footprints, and I was able to play a lot around with the figures. So particularly after I had produced this calculator, I was able to, you know, show that actually sort of living hyper-locally was definitely the most effective way to reduce your footprint. So eating local, traveling local, and supporting local. So food was key. Really, you know, growing as much of it as you can actually in your own backyard. It's already part of your footprint, so why not utilize it? Synthetic inputs were a huge part of the food footprint, particularly in our conventional food systems. Interestingly, don't drive your car to the supermarket to buy a bottle of milk. That actually contributed quite a lot to the overall footprint, was the travel associated with food at an individual level, rather than even the transport of those products around the country. It means that one bottle of milk has a huge ecological footprint. Obviously, less processed packaged food. Things like cooking in groups has great ecological, social, and economic benefits. We know animal products use more land, so in moderation. I did look into the benefits of hunting, and yes, it could have a lower footprint because those animals are on conservation land, and it's not something that we included in the ecological footprint. However, driving to it and obviously using resources, guns and bullets and all that sort of thing. So try and take a few people with you to share the load of the footprint, and practice your shooting so that you use these bullets. So I won't go into all of the, all of the key ways to reduce footprint. Food really is key. All the rest of it, just, you know, we need to buy less. We need to do less. We need to travel less. As soon as we spend money, we're essentially creating ecological footprint. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the future. We often talk about the way that we use and produce households as having a large part of our footprint, but overall, actually, in context, it actually wasn't that much of a huge makeup, mainly because the New Zealand electricity system is mostly renewable. So it still costs a lot, but it doesn't necessarily equate back to your ecological footprint. Obviously, if you burn coal in your fireplace, you're throwing that theory out the window, but anyway. So just quickly to touch on the community scale work. So we worked with these various communities across the country. So from high country rural through to urban residential. They were reasonable sample sizes. They weren't amazing, but we did try and find people who weren't necessarily just open to talking to us about ecological footprint. We kind of bribed a few people to take part who might not take part, to try and get more variety across that. And I think we did a reasonable job. Interestingly, there wasn't a huge amount of variation across different communities in terms of footprints. Hectares, which is a very rural community, did have a much higher footprint due to things. Sorry, I can go to the next one. Due to things like travel, and also a lot of the farming folk actually took international holidays quite regularly, so that was interesting. But interestingly too, they also produced a lot of their own food, and a lot of it in their backyard, and had access to obviously their own meat and that kind of thing. So their food footprint was quite a bit lower. Now, this will be a point where I just quickly highlight pets. This is not the usual, a common category to include in your ecological footprint, but Dr. Robert and Brenda Vale were really hot on it at the time, and it was actually a really interesting piece of research. So obviously a lot of our pets are quite dependent on land. Some of them live on land, and some of them depend on food that requires a lot of land, like meat for cats and dogs. And so, for example, there in Terrace, there's quite a high footprint because they had a lot of pet horses and pet sheep. And those things require land specifically for them to be pets, and that's it. Ultimately it's a consumable. So it caused it wasn't always most favored piece of information that I fed back to people, but it did make people think, which was great. And then I was able to break it down specifically into community footprints, and I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but just to show you, this is the sort of thing that we went to Cromwell with and had a discussion with the community board. So there's the physical location of Cromwell, and then there's, for the population, the amount of land that they're actually using, equivalent, sorry, of the amount of land that they're using, and talking, giving different ways of explaining what their footprint might look like. And just highlighting over to the right-hand side here, we used a way of segmenting New Zealanders into different types of lifestyles. And I just delve into this because it was quite an interesting way to be able to particularly choose the right type of communication for the right type of, for each audience that we're engaging with. So you can see there the Cromwell tribe breakdown, which is how we, so the segmentation was carried out by Jill Caldwell, who wrote this book called The 8 Hidden Tribes, Hidden Classes of New Zealand, or the Hidden Tribes. And it was sort of like stereotyping New Zealanders. So if you think of the these stereotypes down the bottom on the horizontal axis, and you think about what the Raglan tribe stereotype conjures up in your mind, then you're probably on the right foot. You're thinking about the Raglan hippie. You're thinking about people who have chosen to live on lower ecological footprints, mainly because they've simplified their lives, living in smaller communities in particular. Cuba Street tribe, you can imagine the younger generation, Wellington, sort of techno savvy, not a huge income at the moment, so they're just in that transition to sort of earning more money. Biocapacity tribe, there was a lot of Biocapacity tribe across New Zealand, so good old school New Zealand values, number 8 wire, all that kind of thing. If you conjure up that sort of typical Kiwi kind of farming, small town kind of stereotype, versus the North Shore tribe, who are sort of, I'd actually got some bad press on my behalf as well, unfortunately. But so keeping up with the Joneses, wanting to earn more money to be able to have a better lifestyle with more consumables and to spend more money and that kind of thing. So interestingly, when I was able to use Jill Caldwell's research on the hidden tribes and put it against the ecological footprint calculator, it was quite clear that these different segments of our society or different lifestyles do have quite different footprints. From heading down towards a more sustainable 1.8 1.8 Earths right up to, you know, over 3.5, so about 3.6 Earths. So interesting, actually, just on the far left of this graph is the Otara tribe. So Pacific, lower income, but also very family orientated. So a lot of collective shared resources in that community. So really important. And different communities had a mix of these different types of segments of society or lifestyles. So Waiheke quite different to the likes of Cromwell, obviously. And this was one of the graphs that came out of the work that we did with the Royal Society. And so specifically looking back at the driver of income associated with ecological footprint, and there's a really strong correlation between them. So right from lower income earners and through in the Otara tribe, right through to that North Shore tribe who are earning a considerable amount of money. Interestingly, what caused a lot of noise in this data and actually removed out was pets. Again, the size of your pet and not actually necessarily the number of pets that you have equated very well with your income. So just keep that in mind. It's quite interesting piece of information. I actually went on to do a TEDx talk about this particular topic and what to do with if you have too much money, but you still want to lower your ecological footprint. And I guess the main message that I had was you could work less and volunteer more time to doing things, but also if you to convert those consumables as things into services and engaging people, then you're also reducing ecological footprint, but also, you know, increasing that social activity and hopefully supporting your local economy. So there's obviously all those other things like being able to invest your money in perhaps not the best return, but in those areas that are reducing footprint. But ultimately, you know, wherever we're spending money, we're accumulating ecological footprint to a reasonable extent. And my final point on that is that time is also a finite resource, and so we need to be really careful with that too. And so make every minute count. This is something that both my partner Nathan and I have been trying to, I guess, reflect through our own life, which is why we've gone about building an off-grid house here in Invercargill. I guess our next step is to really generate that community around us to look at how we better use the available resources and also utilise the land that we're living on. But it's not always easy, and it's certainly not easy when the rest of society is going in a very different direction. So really briefly, there was a huge amount of work in the food footprint, and organic, things like organic milk have a considerably lower footprint than our conventional. And so the Otago footprint, the Otago food economy picked up this particular theme, and you're able to do things like understanding the what's produced in a region versus what's consumed. So the mass balance or food shed analysis. And for Otago, for example, we're massively oversupplied by dairy. And interestingly, but for things like meat, we're still even undersupplied. And you think of the amount of sheep and beef in Otago, and which really surprised me. Kapiti Coast, as I mentioned earlier, came on as a project partner a bit later on, but they'd done a lot of work in this idea of carrying capacity for their region or for their district. So they looked at things like the use of reticulated water and nutrient content in fresh water and how their population would be able to live within the carrying capacity of those sorts of systems. Interestingly, it's a really interesting read if you wanted to look at it online. Sorry, I didn't actually add the link, I was meant to. But that was back in 2011. This work has been obviously going on for a while, and there's actually, I've got a list later on if anyone wants to see it, of all the other New Zealand footprint projects that have been carried out, and there have been a few. Interestingly, I just 2 weeks ago started a new job working for Environment Southland. And so I work with catchments and catchment groups and looking at, I guess, how to support the implementation of Te Mana Te Wai, but also, biodiversity and climate change regulation that's coming through, but hopefully on a more voluntary basis. But interestingly, I spend a lot of time talking to farmers about the carrying capacity of their farm. And farmers want to talk about this to me. And we talk about a catchment in the context of Te Mana Te Wai, which is ultimately, another way that we're measuring the carrying capacity through the health of the water. So, these concepts are coming out. It's not always described as biocapacity, but it's certainly people are understanding that we're having to, work with the system that naturally is provided for, and to make sure that we're, better balanced. And I guess that's the fundamentals for something like regenerative farming. Whether or not it goes far enough. And obviously we can't have the whole country just covered in regenerative farms, because there's other uses that we need for that land. But it's good to hear that people are thinking about this idea of carrying capacity and biocapacity of the land that we live in. And so finally, I guess this is all very theoretical, and ultimately, I do believe, and we know that we're heading towards a more resource-constrained future, and ultimately, I do feel that the system is going to collapse. If we want to actually ensure that we're going to be able to work within that system in the future, then we need to start preparing to have our system operate quite differently to the way we currently do. And so we need to actually invest some of that biocapacity in building those new systems. So, currently New Zealand actually has a small population, and we do have more productive land than what we're currently using. And we need to make some pretty massive decisions about how we most effectively want to use that biocapacity. Not to mention that we're very likely to have a massively increased population in the future when people see start coming to New Zealand, and we literally can't stop them. So I'm open to having any of those discussions. Hopefully that was helpful and interesting. I'm happy to share any and all of that information, data, whatever people need. And I may not get back to you tomorrow, but I will get back to you eventually. So please let me know. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Ella, thank you very much for that terrific presentation. It's a great example of the value, I think, of the ecological footprint measure, and a very interesting application about how it can be used to help us understand, what we're actually doing and what the opportunities are for making the kinds of changes that would bring us back into balance. What I would like to ask everyone is to put questions into the chat. And while you're doing that, I have one question just for clarification, Ella. I think you mentioned this at the beginning of your talk, that the data you were presenting was about at least 10 years old. Is that correct? All of that data? Yeah.
Yeah.
And my understanding, for example, is that the New Zealand's ecological footprint has increased from, I think you said it was about 2.5 global hectares when you did your study. Is that right? Yeah, I believe it's up at around 6 or 7 global hectares now. So it's more than doubled over that 10-year period.
Right. Yeah.
So just so that people understand, while the relationships between various kinds of land use and so on may be similar to what they were in the past, that the actual numbers have changed probably quite considerably over that decade and a bit.
Yeah.
And some questions are coming in, but I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you another question. When I came across the study that you were involved with that the Royal Society had done, I was quite impressed with the data, but I was very disappointed in the results and the conclusions that they came to, because they seemed, if I recall correctly, and I don't know who the major authors, who actually wrote the report, but it seemed to be saying that it was too difficult to measure New Zealand's biocapacity, and therefore we shouldn't pay much attention to this, which seemed to me a very unfounded conclusion. Perhaps I'm
Yeah.
remembering incorrectly, but could you make any comment about that?
Sure. I think the data is challenging, and particularly in this space, because it's not something that we usually measure and monitor. But ultimately, it depends what you want to use it for. And if you want, beyond reasonable doubt that this data is correct, then yes, it might be very difficult to calculate New Zealand's biocapacity. However, we've got a lot of really great data that does suggest that we've gone a long way towards understanding our natural systems and understanding the types of land that we currently use and how we currently use that land and what it produces. And if we're just going off that basis, then it wasn't that difficult to be able to calculate those footprints. So I think politically it was very challenging, even at the time, and it continues to be a conversation, because we're completely dependent on international trade, and both ways, in terms of our export, but also in terms of our import. And so I don't think it's a politically, there's no political appetite really to have those conversations. And I did wonder if the Royal Society was being a little bit, I guess, responding a little bit to that. I might be able to step in saying that, but anyway. So yeah, because the conversations that came from that day, there wasn't anything that I felt was particular. There was definitely nothing new. It was all sort of highlighting reasonably obvious types of outcomes.
Yeah, it seemed like an excuse to not pursue the research.
Yeah. I think it's a bit
I'll turn to some questions now from the participants, and Mark has one there. So how much fidelity is there in the carrying capacity data, in terms of assumptions around consumption radius? Can you see the questions in the chat yourself there?
I can. I just need to find which one you're relating to.
At 8:27 p.m. is when it was. You can see the
yep.
timing on the right.
With assumptions around radius, amount of transport infraction, does it suggest geographic population distribution across Aotearoa dependent on land type properties? What did you find are the main supply drivers? Properties for carrying capacity of land. How much worse could it be? What is the margin of error? Yeah, okay. Massive questions. And as I said, that was a long time ago, and I have read back over my research, but I'll give it a go. So certainly, I guess as Jack just alluded to, it is difficult to calculate biocapacity, and very much a lot of the research currently goes off current land use, and that the assumption is that current land use is pretty adequately fit for purpose for that type of land. So if people are using it for grazing rather than cropping, then the biocapacity of that land is equated to those uses. And to I guess then the conversion of those different types of land into a common unit the New Zealand hectare or the global hectare. So for the New Zealand hectare, we still had to take those different types of land and being able to bring them to common unit. And I actually just used the Global Footprint Network data for that. Because I guess actually just I was limited in time on resource to be able to look into that in a huge amount of detail and to I guess give it any more rigor than what it already had. So yes, there's definitely a number of assumptions in terms of the data that I was gathering from that top-down, bottom-up approach. It was the best approach for this particular project because it allowed us to be able to produce that calculator versus the likes of an input-output analysis or a component method using sort of FAO data or something like that, which is what Global Footprint Network uses. But there were a huge number of assumptions, and every assumption was made with as much integrity as they had at the time. But I guess, yeah, and my intention was always to be able to give enough transparency to this that people would be able to critique it but continue to use it and build on it. Unfortunately, that hasn't necessarily been the case, and I have tried to hand over this information for that kind of sharing and building on, but I haven't really managed to succeed even in terms of giving that calculator out to a range of different parties because it's so complex and because of the amount of data that goes into it, even when all the assumptions are spelled out in relation to that data. So great question. Probably haven't answered all of it because there are a number of different components in there. Come back if I've missed anything major.
Okay, well, we'll move on to another question here from Paul Bruce. Says, can you describe a person's living style which would bring them under the 1.2 ecological footprint? I think that's the fair share idea.
Yeah.
And would that be easier in an urban or rural place? Yeah.
Yeah, great question, Paul. So interestingly, the particular household whose members who were close to a fairer share, they weren't quite there. I think they were about 1.35 or something like that, but considerably lower than most other households. They actually lived on Waiheke. And one of the big problems with the Waiheke footprint was the ferry travel. So the particular ferries that they were using at the time had quite a high energy use per passenger kilometre travelled. So every time you jumped on the ferry. But anyway, so this particular family really didn't use the ferry very often. They didn't actually leave the island very often. They had a small house. It was a one-income family where they worked from home. Had an electric bike to get around this, reasonably confined community. Obviously, it's an island. They did have a cat. They grew a lot of their own food. They were vegetarian, but not vegan. But it was all, all very much in moderation. Interestingly, they did make the decision that every couple of years they would go back to the UK to see family. And even with that, they were able to keep that low footprint. So it does go to show, I guess, that, if we were, for example, to say that we had a quota and we had a quota fair share, that it's still about decisions we make about how we use that. And if flying back to the UK is important enough for you, then you'll make, other changes in your life to reduce footprint elsewhere. So they were a really interesting family. There were actually a few rural people who also had considerably low footprints. Again, if we take pets out of the equation, and particularly if they, did a lot of hunting on their own land for wild meat, and they didn't travel too far, or they lived in reasonable proximity to a small urban area.
Yeah, so it's not a terribly deprived lifestyle at all. I mean, it can be quite comfortable. Another question here from Deirdre. If our imports and exports are so great, what prospects do you see for reducing both of these? And if it includes going back to doing a lot more industry ourselves, or clothing, for example, what would be the obstacles you see to, bringing the production home, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. And I guess the major obstacle is that we live in a system where imports and exports are freely available. And so I think it's asking what would be the reasonable purpose that we would have to do this transition. If it was a requirement and it was just going to happen, we had to make it happen. Obviously, some of the challenges around that are the production of those raw materials to be able to produce that. We don't currently produce things like cotton for clothing, but we obviously have other materials like wool. It would be interesting to look at the life cycle of equated back to ecological footprint, something like wool versus cotton. And also the manufacturing and processing required to do that. But ultimately, if we were just supplying for New Zealand, it's still the amount of resource required to set up that industry and to generate interest. So yeah, interesting, Robin, definitely. Hemp, linen, and linen from flax. Flax is a really interesting one, and I probably hold it. I hope, definitely, particularly in Southland, I hope that we come back to flax in the future. It's an incredibly versatile product. Again, there's a lot of energy that goes into the processing of those flax fibres, but if we can find a way to do that, particularly without fossil fuels, then we might be looking at a future. But it's really going back to knowledge that we don't necessarily hold a lot of in our society anymore, about how to produce our own goods and services, and particularly how to do that without using huge amounts of fossil fuel energy. So it would be a process of relearning that for a lot of our communities to be able to produce those things more locally.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment as well about exports and its relationship to New Zealand's biocapacity excess. While the world as a whole is in deficit, New Zealand is one of the few countries that has a biocapacity excess. It actually produces more than it consumes. But what's interesting about that is that biocapacity excess has been declining significantly year by year, because we're actually destroying our ability to continue producing. And I think that's something that really has to be highlighted to help people understand the implications of ecological overshoot. We're living off the future, and I was really struck by your data where 82% of the footprint has to do with exports. And the exports, I think, are responsible for our biocapacity decline, because we're exporting a lot of our biocapacity. So, we see the money coming in as desirable, but we're actually destroying our ability to continue feeding ourselves and providing for ourselves in the future. And given that we're a small island nation in the middle of the South Pacific, it doesn't seem like a very wise strategy, I would say.
No, and we can clearly see the impact of those declining systems, the health of those declining systems. I mean, water quality is a very, very large elephant in the room. And, as I mentioned at the end there, Te Manawai is, the ultimate in ecological, and as an ecological indicator of health of our ecosystem. And we haven't seen overall collapse, but as we mentioned from the Stockholm, resilient the planetary boundaries, we know that we're in massive overshoot in a number of those systems. For New Zealand, it's water quality. We know, we know fisheries are in major decline. And so, what will it? I guess what will it take for those systems to entirely collapse and for us to have no way to produce, goods and services? And ultimately, how close towards that tipping point do we actually want to get? And yeah, if that requires us to completely rethink our economic model, which it does ultimately, but we need to get pretty brave to do that, then we need to do it.
Yeah.
I guess what is it that's going to convince people that's the case?
Yeah. I have a question from Joanna sitting next to me here, so I'll read it out. How have the regions that have used the ecological footprint measure used that data? You spoke of a few councils or regions that have done some studies. Can you tell us a little bit how they've actually used the data? And also, can you give us some idea of how much it would actually cost to do a footprint study for a region or a district? So that's two questions.
Sure. So yeah, there'd been back in the early 2000s, there'd been a lot of work actually by MFE looking at the ecological footprint across New Zealand. So McDonald and Patterson sort of did a lot of that work, and before them, Bicknell, who helped develop some new methodologies for ecological footprinting. So, from that work, there was a serious amount of interest. They looked, and then a number of councils picked it up. So Waikato Council, it was Waikato Regional Council, I think by that stage, yes, did some work around sort of the ecological footprint of their communities. Kapiti probably picked it up in the biggest way. And as I mentioned, that carrying capacity work. So they were really looking at biocapacity in terms of living within those natural systems limits and how they would, I guess, provide for their community. So they used it in that way. They also used it in terms of biocapacity and land use options. So they were quite big on looking at, I guess, how not to lose that high productive soil to urbanisation. So again, back in sort of 2010, they looked at how to protect their high producing soils, which unfortunately didn't stand up against the RMA as I understood it, which sounds particularly, it's really sad. And then later on, so they moved a little bit away from the biocapacity work and they used it more looking at the ecological footprint. So they had the Greener Streets competition. So they were using the ecological footprint to generate interest for communities or streets to come together to look at how they might collectively reduce their ecological footprint over the course of a year. So they measured the footprint at the beginning and then at the end, and I think they even provided some funding to these streets to put on community events and help share resources and try to reduce and have the challenge of reducing their footprint. As I understood it, it was incredibly successful, not just from a standpoint of educating around ecological footprint and how to reduce, but actually in generating, social good and social fabric. People started meeting each other for the first time on their street, and their kids could play together. And you hope that in time, actually, that social connection could also help to not only, potentially reduce footprint, but actually to create that resilience that we know we needed for those shocks. The Christchurch earthquakes is a good example, or those possibly, or very likely, those longer term shocks that we can go through climate change and potential resource constraints.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a couple of questions here asking about, the role of making individual household lifestyle choices contrasting that with government initiatives in terms of environmental taxes or reducing perverse subsidies and environmental regulations, things of that sort. Would you like to comment on the relation between the two?
Yeah, I guess it's not something that, well, it was somewhat covered. I mean, it's that difference between voluntary and involuntary change. And from the questionnaires, and in particular in relation to the 8 Hidden Tribes work, it was really interesting when I talked to people who were predominantly the likes of the Biocapacity tribe. And I remember one questionnaire in particular, and the guy, I managed to drive him to the pub and to give him the beer in order to have him sit down with me for an hour and talk to me about his lifestyle and what he consumes. And he didn't see himself as a greenie or anyone who had any interest in lowering his ecological footprint, yet he had one of the lowest footprints because of how he had chosen to live his life, and because of his connection to community. And actually, he was an older gentleman, and he was just doing what he had always done. He wasn't wasteful. He didn't feel that he needed to buy a lot of new stuff. He had what he needed, and he was fulfilled in that way. So I guess in terms of when we're thinking about whether or not to regulate, we need to really understand what's driving people to that behaviour in the first place. And otherwise, we can end up with some really perverse outcomes. And I think we're, I'm trying to think of an example, actually, sorry, but what's that? Ultimately, in terms of a hierarchy, you'd hope that we've exhausted all of the options for taking people with us. But ultimately, unfortunately, I think doing that to get to where we actually need to be is going to take too long. And at some stage, we need to put the pressure on. And I guess that's ultimately, if you could take the example of COVID and vaccination, the government's decided that there's a pace that we need to get to, and the rules have come out, and we're feeling also backlash from that. And there's real concern about what the social impact of that's going to be whenever we bring in regulation and rules, because it's not always the outcome that we expect or hope for. Interestingly, for something like COVID, it's actually creating an entire new food network, for example, down here in Southland. So people know that they're not going to be able to take part in the conventional system. They're going out, they're not expecting that they're going to be able to go to the supermarket or readily partake in attending restaurants and that kind of thing. So they're actually generating their own trading system for food, which is a really interesting outcome and not what I expected would necessarily happen.
Yeah. There's another question here about the footprint, essentially, I think, of fossil fuels, and if we removed it for food, transport, and infrastructure, what impact would that have on our overall footprint if we took fossil fuels out of the equation?
Yeah, there's a few just just literally next to the panel. Where the line is singing.
Someone, Gail,
you.
Go ahead.
I can't mute it. I'm trying. No. There you go. Sorry. Yeah, so the land that revenue number was on so in terms of land, yeah, so energy land was you know, about 30% of the 30% of the overall footprint. So if we remove fossil fuels from that, then yeah, we'd be 30% lower. I guess it's not that simple because there's going to have been a whole lot of other embodied energy in that footprint that we will not have been able to have calculated. One of the real challenges around ecological footprint calculations is actually finding that life cycle data of products, services, because it's not something that we've done a lot of, and it's certainly not easily accessible. I purchased some of it actually from the likes of the Foot Forward organisation in the UK, and then also from the Global Footprint Network. So it's not as simple as just saying, okay, well, 30% of the footprint is energy land, and therefore if you remove that, then you've reduced it, because the entire rest of the system has ultimately been built on cheap fossil fuels, you know, your buildings and your roads and your all that sort of thing. Yeah, so that probably didn't help you a lot.
Yeah, and also it obviously depends on what sort of energy sources are used to replace fossil fuels. Because unfortunately, most so-called renewables require fossil fuels to develop and install and maintain and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, entirely. And you know, this renewable future that we've had, we're going to have, but no one's yet figured out how we're going to create, you know, the next generation of the infrastructure required to actually provide that the infrastructure to build those renewable energy. So yeah, we're a long way from where we need to be if we're going to make that shift.
There's another question here about 11 million people being able to, you know, live here. If our ecological footprint, in fact, has increased over 200% since the data you presented were taken, and our population has increased maybe 1 million, could we still support 11 million people at that? I mean, if we have an increased footprint, it seems to me we're going to have a much lower, we may be much closer to our population carrying capacity at our current consumption level, is my guess.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. And not to mention that our biocapacity will have decreased because of our declining health of our systems, our ecological systems as well. So particularly over that last decade, with dairy boom and everything else. So I don't know what those new figures are, but it would be interesting. It wouldn't actually be that difficult for someone to redo those figures. I just didn't have enough time for this evening. But yeah, you definitely bet that it's going to be a lot lower than 11 million now.
Yeah, it seems to me that, you know, all of this data speak to the need for more information about this whole process, and at the local level. You know, national government requires each council to keep growing and providing, you know, more titles and space for housing development so population can increase. But it's destroying the biocapacity and also the quality of life for many communities. And it seems to me that one of the most important things that people can do is push their councils to do studies looking at the carrying capacity of their region, because ultimately that's what they're going to have to work with. You know? Yeah. Well, we still have a few questions here. But go ahead.
I do actually have a paper by McDonald and Bicknell from 2003 that looked at trade between regions, which was really interesting. So as a background, it did calculate the biocapacity of the major regions across New Zealand. and then how resources and biocapacity was essentially shared across the country. I'm happy to share that if anyone's interested in looking at it in more detail.
Yeah. Well, Ella, that's been a terrific presentation and discussion. It's really, to me, one of the most important issues that we're not facing, unfortunately, that we need to be. So getting this information out there, I think is really, really important. The recording will be on the Our Climate Declaration website as well. Ella, I'm assuming we can put your slides there as well for people to access.
Sure. Yeah.
Slides. Yeah. Just keep in mind, everyone, that that data is about 10 years old or so. There are new data about New Zealand on the Ecological Footprint Network website. It's not broken down nearly as detailed as the information that Ella has presented to us this evening. But in terms of an overview about New Zealand and other countries and the world as a whole, the Ecological Footprint website is a great resource for information on the ecological footprint and this whole issue of biocapacity and carrying capacity.
So, and really interestingly, so not only is my data quite old, but it is calculated using the New Zealand hectare rather than the global hectare. And so when you're talking about even the ecological footprint of New Zealanders, Jack, the unit is different. So it's not directly comparable. And I can convert the New Zealand footprint in global New Zealand hectares into the global hectares. And even one of my hidden slides actually shows that. But yeah, just keep that in mind when you're reading that information. It's complete in its own right, rather than being able to be comparable with what I've done.
Great. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that point. I think it's an important point in terms of one of the basic parameters in the whole calculation. Yeah. Terrific, Ella. Thank you very, very much for this. I know you put a lot of effort into that presentation, and it really shows, and it's a great resource that we have now. We often get hundreds of views on the when we put the presentation on the YouTube channel that we've created for this series. So, you know, hopefully it'll be seen by lots more folks. And this is the last session for this fiscal year, for calendar year. And we don't have a date for the next one, but it'll probably be late January or early February, and we'll get a notice out to everyone, as well as putting it up on the Our Climate Declaration website. But what I would like to suggest, if anyone is interested, I would like to hold just an open chat session early in December to reflect on what we've learned in the series so far and where we might take it. So if anyone has ideas about that, they can either email me or just show up to the open mic, so to speak. And I'll set that up for early December. And hopefully we'll get a discussion going. And apologies to those whose questions didn't get answered. But if you have another look at Ella's data, you can probably find an answer. So it'll be in there. So thanks again, Ella. And thanks everyone for participating. And hopefully we'll see you in early December or in the new year. All the best, folks. Bye-bye.